A crash in the wilderness. The night was unusually quiet in the dense forest, the kind of silence that made even the smallest sound feel amplified. Ethan Grayson, a solitary ex-soldier, moved through the woods with the precision of someone accustomed to danger. His rugged frame was clad in weathered survival gear, and his eyes scanned the surroundings with practiced vigilance. Life on this remote planet had honed his instincts, forcing him to anticipate threats before they arrived. As he approached the clearing where he often gathered supplies, the sky above erupted with a streak of blazing light. It cut across the stars like a fiery arrow, descending rapidly into the forest. The distant sound of an impact followed, a dull thud, accompanied by the faint tremor of the ground beneath his boots. Ethan froze, his rifle instinctively swinging to his shoulder as his mind raced. A meteor, he muttered to himself, though he knew better. Meteors didn't typically land with such precision. Curiosity warred with caution, but Ethan's curiosity won. With his rifle at the ready, he made his way toward the source of the disturbance, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The smell of burned foliage grew stronger as he neared the crash site. Finally, he emerged into a clearing, where the dim light of the forest was replaced by the eerie glow of an alien escape pod. The pod was sleek, its surface shimmering with a faint metallic hue that seemed to shift colors under the flickering emergency lights. Steam hissed from fractures in its hull, and the surrounding trees bore scorch marks from its descent. Ethan approached cautiously, his finger hovering over the trigger of his weapon. Peering inside the pod, he spotted a figure slumped against the interior. His breath caught. It wasn't just any alien, it was a woman. Her emerald green skin shimmered under the lights, and her features were delicate, almost human. A torn white garment clung to her form, revealing injuries across her arms and legs. Despite her otherworldly appearance, she looked vulnerable, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to leave. Years of survival had taught him that helping others often brought trouble, especially when it came to aliens. But as he stared at the unconscious figure, something shifted within him. She wasn't a threat, at least not now. She needed help. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. Carefully, he reached into the pod and scooped her up. She was surprisingly light, her skin cool to the touch. A faint, sweet scent, like a mix of wildflowers and rain, lingered around her. The journey back to his cabin was arduous. The alien woman stirred faintly but didn't wake, her head resting against his chest. Ethan's arms burned from the effort, but he pushed forward, his mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why had she crashed here? And most importantly, what kind of danger was he inviting into his secluded life? At last, he reached the concealed entrance to his home, a reinforced cabin nestled among the trees. With a grunt, he shifted her weight and punched in the access code. The heavy door slid open with a hiss, revealing a sparsely furnished interior, functional and secure, just the way he liked it. He placed her gently on the spare cot in the corner, his eyes scanning her injuries. Cuts and bruises marred her skin, but nothing appeared life-threatening. Grabbing his medkit, he began cleaning and dressing her wounds, his hands steady despite the surreal nature of the task. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the strange patterns that seemed to shimmer beneath her skin, like faint traces of bioluminescence. Her beauty was otherworldly, but Ethan pushed the thought aside. She was a stranger, and for all he knew, her arrival could spell disaster. When her wounds were tended, he leaned back in his chair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. The soft hum of the cabin's generator filled the silence as he watched her sleep, his rifle resting within arm's reach. What have I gotten myself into? He muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Hours passed, and Ethan dozed lightly, always on edge. When the first signs of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin's reinforced shutters, the alien woman stirred. Her golden eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharp and alert. She sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. Where am I? She asked, her voice soft and melodic, tinged with an accent Ethan couldn't place. "You're safe," he replied, his tone cautious. "I found you in a crashed pod. You were injured." She blinked, her gaze settling on him. "Who are you?" "Ethan Grayson," he said simply. "And you?" Her brows furrowed in concentration. I don't know. I can't remember." Great, Ethan thought, leaning back in his chair. Just what I needed, a mysterious, amnesiac alien. "Well, until you figure it out, you can stay here. But if trouble follows you, don't expect me to stick my neck out." A faint smile touched her lips, despite the tension in her expression. "Noted. Thank you, Ethan." He grunted in acknowledgement, though he didn't trust her gratitude. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Still, as he looked into her golden eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that his quiet life had just been irreversibly changed. And somewhere in the shadows of the forest, the faint hum of alien technology began to stir. Ethan spent the following hours restlessly pacing the small cabin. His instincts told him this situation was far from ordinary, and every moment of silence felt like the calm before a storm. The alien woman, still weak from her injuries, slept fitfully on the cot. Occasionally, her body would tense, and a soft murmur would escape her lips, words in a language he couldn't understand. Ethan watched her from a distance, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The cabin was his sanctuary, built after years of fighting in wars that had left him scarred both physically and emotionally. He'd chosen this isolated planet to escape the chaos of intergalactic politics and the constant noise of civilization. But now, the solitude he had worked so hard to maintain had been shattered by the arrival of this strange, otherworldly woman. When she finally stirred, Ethan was seated at the small table across the room, cleaning his rifle. Her golden eyes opened slowly, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings before settling on him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she tried to sit up, wincing at the effort. Ethan stood, setting his rifle aside as he approached cautiously. "You shouldn't move too much," he said, his voice gruff. "You're still healing." Her gaze softened, though it was clear she was still disoriented. "Thank you, for helping me. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Let's just say I don't like leaving people, or aliens, for dead. Do you remember anything? Your name, where you're from?" She hesitated, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Lyra," she said finally. "That's the only thing I'm certain of. My name is Lyra." "Well, Lyra, you picked a hell of a place to crash. This planet isn't exactly on anyone's tourist map." Lyra's lips twitched into a faint smile, but it faded quickly. I was running. I think. But I can't remember from what or why." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't equipped to deal with this kind of situation. His life here was built on simplicity and self-reliance, not on unraveling intergalactic mysteries. Still, something about Lyra's vulnerability made it impossible for him to turn her away. As the hours passed, Lyra grew stronger. She moved gingerly around the cabin, inspecting her surroundings with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Ethan kept a close watch, noting the way her eyes lingered on the small details, the faded photos on the wall, the tools neatly arranged on the workbench. She asked him questions, simple ones at first, about the cabin and the planet. Her voice was soft, melodic, and despite his efforts to remain detached, Ethan found himself answering. By evening, the tension between them had eased somewhat. They shared a quiet meal, the silence punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire. Ethan avoided looking directly at her, but he couldn't ignore the way her presence seemed to fill the room. There was an energy about her, something that went beyond her alien appearance. It was as if she carried a piece of the stars within her. When night fell, Ethan showed Lyra how to lock the cabin's reinforced door and handed her a small energy blade for protection. "In case something happens while I'm asleep," he said, his tone brisk. "But don't get any ideas about using it on me." Lyra's eyes widened slightly before she nodded. "I wouldn't. I couldn't. You've saved me." Ethan grunted in response, retreating to his own corner of the cabin. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to quiet. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, but for the first time in years, Ethan felt a different kind of unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that Lyra's arrival was the beginning of something much larger than either of them could comprehend. As sleep finally claimed him, a faint hum echoed through the forest. Unseen by either of them, a pair of glowing red eyes flickered to life in the shadows, and a low, mechanical voice whispered a single word into the night: "Found." Morning broke over the forest with a muted golden light, filtering through the thick canopy of leaves. Ethan was already awake, seated at the cabin's small workbench, methodically checking his weapons. He hadn't slept much. Something about the faint hum he'd heard during the night gnawed at him, though he convinced himself it was just paranoia. Lyra moved quietly behind him, her steps tentative but steadier than before. She seemed hesitant to disturb him, instead exploring the cabin's modest interior. Her delicate hands ran over the reinforced walls, the tools meticulously arranged on the shelves, and the small, worn photo of a younger Ethan in a military uniform. She didn't ask questions, sensing the memories were likely ones he preferred to keep buried. "I can feel it," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. Ethan turned, eyebrows raised in question. "Something is out there. Something searching." Ethan's grip tightened on the pistol he'd been cleaning. "What kind of something?" Lyra hesitated, her golden eyes flickering with uncertainty. "I don't know exactly. It's like a presence. A signal, faint but growing stronger. I felt it even before I woke up." Ethan cursed under his breath. He'd spent years keeping this cabin hidden, reinforcing it with tech scavenged from the remnants of old wars, ensuring it was invisible to prying eyes. Yet Lyra's arrival seemed to have brought unwanted attention. He didn't blame her, not yet, but the timing was too coincidental to ignore. "Are they after you?" he asked bluntly, his tone sharper than he intended. "Whoever, or whatever, is out there." Lyra crossed her arms, her expression clouded. "I think so. But I don't remember why. I told you, I was running. That's all I know." Ethan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm. "All right. If someone's coming, we need to be ready. I've got motion sensors around the perimeter. If anything gets too close, we'll know." Lyra nodded, though her unease was palpable. She followed him as he stepped outside, into the crisp morning air. The forest around the cabin seemed peaceful, but Ethan's sharp eyes scanned every shadow, every movement among the trees. He activated the sensors hidden beneath patches of moss and fallen leaves, each one feeding into a secure network inside the cabin. As he worked, Lyra's attention drifted upward, her gaze fixed on the sky. "Do humans always live this way?" she asked suddenly. Ethan glanced at her, frowning. "What way?" "In fear. Always looking over your shoulder, always preparing for danger." Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was a sadness in it that made Ethan pause. "This isn't fear," he said gruffly. "It's survival. Fear is what keeps you frozen. Survival is what keeps you alive." Lyra didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched as he finished setting the last of the sensors, his movements efficient and deliberate. "I think I used to live like this too," she said finally. "Before everything." Ethan looked at her, his expression softening for the briefest moment. "Then you'll understand why I don't take chances." Back inside the cabin, Ethan showed Lyra how to monitor the sensors from the terminal. She picked up on the technology quickly, her fingers dancing over the interface with surprising ease. It wasn't long before she began modifying the system, using components scavenged from her crashed pod. This will make it more precise, she explained, her voice filled with quiet determination. If they're using cloaking technology, we'll still be able to detect them. Ethan watched her work, impressed despite himself. Whatever her past life had been, it was clear she wasn't just running blindly. There was intelligence and resourcefulness beneath her unease, qualities Ethan respected more than he cared to admit. As the day wore on, a faint beep from the terminal interrupted their preparations. Lyra and Ethan exchanged a tense glance before he leaned over the display. One of the sensors had triggered, a faint blip on the edge of the perimeter. "It's moving," Ethan muttered, tracking the signal. "Slow. Deliberate. Whatever it is, it's not a wild animal." Lyra's face paled, but she remained focused. "It's them," she whispered. "I can feel it." Ethan grabbed his rifle and nodded toward her. "Stay inside. Lock the door and don't open it unless it's me." "I can help," she protested, but Ethan's sharp glare silenced her. "Not now. If things go south, I need you alive. Got it?" Reluctantly, Lyra nodded and stepped back as Ethan moved toward the door. The forest seemed darker than it had that morning, the sunlight struggling to pierce through the thickening canopy. Rifle in hand, Ethan stepped outside, his senses heightened. He moved silently, following the signal toward the sensor that had triggered. The forest was eerily quiet, and every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set his nerves on edge. When he reached the area, he crouched low, scanning the surroundings with his rifle's scope. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But then, from the corner of his eye, he caught movement. A sleek, metallic drone hovered silently among the branches, its red eye glowing faintly. Ethan's stomach dropped. The drone was too advanced for this backwater planet, definitely not local. Without hesitation, he fired, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing through the forest. The drone sparked and fell to the ground, its mechanical hum fading as it hit the dirt. Ethan approached cautiously, inspecting the wreckage. The markings on its surface were unfamiliar, but there was no mistaking its purpose. "They found us," he muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. The hunt had begun. Ethan returned to the cabin with the wrecked drone in tow, its broken frame dangling from his grip like a grim trophy. Lyra stood by the window, her golden eyes wide with apprehension. She turned as he entered, her gaze darting to the drone. The sight of it confirmed her worst fears. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's only the beginning." Ethan set the drone down on the workbench, his movements sharp and efficient. "I figured as much. This thing wasn't built for scouting wildlife." He gestured at the sleek, alien design. "They sent it to track you." Lyra swallowed hard, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "They must have followed the signal from the pod. I tried to disable its beacon before I crashed, but I wasn't fast enough." Ethan nodded grimly. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is how we handle what's coming next." He tapped the drone's casing, his brow furrowed in concentration. This thing was transmitting. "I cut the signal when I shot it, but odds are, whoever sent it already knows where we are." Lyra's breathing quickened. "You don't understand. They won't stop. They'll send more drones, and when they're sure, they'll come themselves. They're relentless." Ethan glanced at her, his expression hard but not unkind. "Then we make it too costly for them to bother." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "How? There's only the two of us. You saw what they sent. We don't stand a chance." Ethan leaned closer, his voice low and steady. "I've been outnumbered before. Numbers don't mean a damn thing if you know how to fight smart. But I need you focused, not panicking. Can you do that?" Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Her fear was still evident, but there was a spark of determination in her gaze. What do we do? First, we rig the cabin, Ethan said, already pulling tools and materials from his shelves. Booby traps, decoys, whatever we can manage with what we've got. Second, we figure out exactly who we're dealing with and what they want. You said you don't remember much, but there's got to be something, anything, that can give us an edge. Lyra closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. I remember fragments. They're not just after me. They're after what I know, what my kind can do. She opened her eyes, their golden glow more intense now. They want to harness us. Use us. Ethan's jaw tightened. Sounds familiar. Power-hungry bastards don't care who they hurt as long as they get what they want. He pulled a length of wire taut, securing it around a makeshift trap. Well, they're not getting you. Not while I'm here. For the next few hours, the cabin became a hive of activity. Ethan worked with methodical precision, setting up traps and reinforcing the perimeter while Lyra modified the cabin's sensors with parts salvaged from the wrecked drone. Despite the tension, there was a growing sense of partnership between them, an unspoken understanding that they would face whatever came together. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier. Ethan stood at the window, scanning the tree line with his rifle at the ready. Lyra sat nearby, her hands gripping the edge of the table as she stared at the sensor display. Then, a faint ping echoed from the terminal. Lyra's head snapped up, her fingers flying over the controls. Movement. Multiple signals. They're coming. Ethan's grip tightened on his rifle. How many? She hesitated, her face paling. At least a dozen. Maybe more. Great, Ethan muttered. Just another quiet evening in paradise. Lyra stood, her fear giving way to resolve. I can help. I'm not just going to hide while you fight for me. Ethan looked at her, his expression unreadable. I'll take all the help I can get. But if it comes down to it, you get out. Understand? I won't leave you, she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Ethan didn't argue. There wasn't time. The first sign of movement came moments later, a faint rustling in the trees, followed by the glint of metal reflecting the moonlight. The drones were advancing, their red eyes glowing like malevolent beacons in the dark. Ethan fired the first shot, his rifle cracking through the stillness. The lead drone sparked and crashed to the ground, but the others didn't slow. They moved with eerie precision, their mechanical limbs cutting through the underbrush as they closed in. Lyra activated the traps Ethan had rigged, and a series of explosions lit up the forest. Several drones were caught in the blasts, their frames shattered by shrapnel. But more kept coming, their numbers overwhelming the defenses. Ethan and Lyra fought side by side, her quick thinking and technological expertise complementing his combat skills. She used her glowing hands to overload the circuitry of the drones that got too close, while Ethan's rifle took down those at a distance. The battle was chaotic and brutal, but by the time the last drone fell, the forest was silent once more. Ethan leaned heavily against the wall of the cabin, his breathing ragged. Lyra stood beside him, her emerald skin glistening with sweat but her eyes burning with determination. They'll send more, she said softly. This was just the first wave. Ethan nodded, his expression grim. Then we'd better be ready. The aftermath of the battle left the cabin surrounded by smoking debris and twisted remains of the drones. Ethan surveyed the carnage, his rifle still in hand, his eyes scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. The silence felt uneasy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Lyra stood beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the faint glow of the smoldering wreckage. Her hands trembled slightly, though she fought to keep her fear from showing. Ethan turned to her, his voice low but firm. We bought ourselves some time, but not much. They'll regroup and come back stronger. We need to figure out our next move. Lyra nodded, though her gaze lingered on the remains of the drones. "They'll send more than just machines next time. When they're certain I'm here, they'll come themselves." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Then we can't stay here. This place is compromised. But we can't run blind either. If we're going to stand a chance, we need to know exactly what we're up against." Lyra's hands clenched into fists, her glowing skin dimming slightly as her emotions churned. "I think I can access the drone's data. They were transmitting a signal to their operators. If I can tap into it, I might be able to learn more, who they are, what they're planning." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You sure? That sounds like it could lead them straight to us." "I can mask the signal," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her features. "It's risky, but it's the only way we'll get answers." He considered her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Let's do it. But if anything seems off, we cut the connection immediately." "Understood." Lyra agreed, and together they brought the wreckage of one of the drones into the cabin. Ethan cleared a space on the workbench, while Lyra retrieved tools from the scattered remnants of her escape pod. As she worked, her movements became more precise, her focus sharpening. Ethan couldn't help but notice how her energy seemed to shift, growing stronger the more she engaged with the alien technology. For hours, Lyra tinkered with the drone, her hands glowing faintly as she manipulated its circuits. Ethan stood guard by the window, his rifle ready, his eyes scanning the forest. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the air thick with unspoken fears and unyielding determination. Finally, Lyra let out a small gasp, her golden eyes lighting up. "I've got it. The signal is active. I'm accessing their network." Ethan stepped closer, his grip tightening on his rifle. "What are you seeing?" Her fingers moved rapidly over the drone's control panel, and her expression darkened. "They're tracking my energy signature. They've been following me since I escaped. There's a command vessel orbiting this planet, heavily armed, with a full squadron of soldiers." Ethan cursed under his breath. "Great. Anything else?" Lyra's brow furrowed as she delved deeper into the data. "There's more. They're not just here for me. They're looking for something else on this planet. Something ancient." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Ancient? What do you mean?" She shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice. "I don't know. The data is fragmented. But it's important enough that they've diverted significant resources to finding it." Ethan leaned against the table, his mind racing. "So, not only are they hunting you, but they're also digging for some kind of treasure." "Perfect." Lyra glanced at him, her expression resolute. "Whatever they're looking for, it could be the key to stopping them. If we can find it first." Ethan cut her off. "Hold on. You want to go chasing after some ancient artifact while they've got a warship in orbit? That sounds like suicide." "It's not just about me," Lyra said, her voice rising. "If they find whatever it is, they'll use it to expand their power. This isn't just my fight, it's bigger than that." Ethan stared at her for a long moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. But we do this my way. No rushing in blind." Lyra nodded, relief softening her features. "Agreed." As they began to plan their next steps, the tension in the air shifted. Despite the looming danger, there was a sense of purpose between them now, a shared resolve that neither had expected. The cabin might have been compromised, but their fight was far from over. Outside, the forest was quiet once more, but the faint hum of distant machinery echoed through the trees, a reminder that the battle had only just begun. Ethan and Lyra were no longer just survivors, they were resistance. And as the night deepened, their determination burned brighter than ever. Ethan's cabin was a shadow of its former self, its once pristine interior now cluttered with salvaged drone parts and hastily packed supplies. Lyra sat cross-legged on the floor, her glowing hands hovering over a small device she'd assembled from fragments of her escape pod and the wreckage of the drones. Ethan watched her work, his rifle slung over his shoulder and a deep frown etched on his face. "We need to move before they figure out we're still here," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. "How much longer?" "Almost done," Lyra replied, not looking up. Her golden eyes flickered as she concentrated on the intricate circuitry beneath her fingers. "This device will mask my energy signature and scramble their tracking systems. It should buy us time." Ethan nodded, though his eyes drifted to the window, scanning the darkened tree line. The forest felt different tonight, heavier, more foreboding. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound set his nerves on edge. He knew their enemies weren't far behind. "We're not just running," Lyra said suddenly, her voice breaking his train of thought. "We're going after whatever they're looking for." Ethan turned to her, his frown deepening. "We don't even know what it is. Could be a weapon, a trap, or something worse. And even if we find it, how do we know we'll be able to stop them?" Lyra's hands stilled, and she looked up at him, her golden eyes steady. "I don't know. But I do know that if they get to it first, no one will be able to stop them. We can't just hide and hope this goes away." Ethan held her gaze for a long moment before sighing. "All right. But we do this carefully. If things go south, we pull out." Lyra nodded, returning to her work. A few minutes later, she straightened and held up the device. "It's ready. This should keep them off our trail for a while." Ethan grabbed his pack, slinging it over his shoulder. "Then let's not waste any more time." They left the cabin under the cover of darkness, moving swiftly and silently through the forest. Lyra followed Ethan's lead, her movements surprisingly graceful for someone still recovering from her injuries. The faint hum of the masking device filled the air around them, a reassuring reminder that, for now, they were invisible to their pursuers. After an hour of trekking, they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a wide valley. Lyra pulled out a small holographic map she'd extracted from the drone's data. A glowing blue marker indicated their target, a set of ruins buried deep within the valley. "This is it," she said, pointing to the marker. "The signal they're tracking is coming from here." Ethan studied the map, his eyes narrowing. "It's a long way down, and we'll be exposed the whole way." "We don't have a choice," Lyra replied. "If we wait, they'll beat us there." Ethan adjusted the strap of his rifle. "Then we move fast and stay low. If we're lucky, we'll get there before they do." They descended into the valley, the terrain growing rougher and more treacherous with each step. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness seemed to hang over the landscape. Lyra shivered, her glowing skin dimming slightly as a sense of unease crept over her. Ethan noticed her discomfort. "What is it?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But it feels wrong. Like something is watching us." Ethan scanned their surroundings, his rifle at the ready. "Keep moving. We'll deal with whatever's down there when we find it." As they neared the ruins, the sense of unease grew stronger. The structures were ancient, their jagged edges jutting out of the ground like the bones of a long-dead giant. Strange symbols adorned the crumbling walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. Lyra hesitated, her golden eyes fixed on the symbols. "This isn't just a ruin," she said softly. "It's a vault." "A vault for what?" Ethan asked, his grip tightening on his rifle. Before she could answer, the faint hum of approaching engines reached their ears. Ethan's blood ran cold as he turned to see the dark silhouettes of enemy drones descending into the valley. Behind them, the unmistakable shape of a troop carrier loomed on the horizon. "They're here," Lyra whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we'd better move. Whatever's in that vault, we're not letting them have it." They sprinted toward the ruins, the sound of the drones growing louder with each passing second. Ethan fired at the nearest ones, his shots precise and lethal, but there were too many to hold off for long. Lyra used her glowing hands to disrupt their circuits, her movements quick and desperate. Reaching the entrance of the vault, they ducked inside just as the first wave of enemy soldiers landed. The interior of the structure was dark and cold, the faint glow of the symbols casting eerie shadows on the walls. Lyra led the way, her steps guided by an unexplainable pull toward the center of the vault. "This way," she said, her voice urgent. "We're close." Ethan followed, his rifle ready. The sounds of pursuit echoed behind them, the soldiers moving quickly through the ruins. Whatever they were about to find, Ethan knew they would have to fight to keep it. The central chamber of the vault loomed before them, its entrance marked by intricate carvings that pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. Lyra hesitated, her golden eyes fixed on the patterns, her breathing shallow. Ethan glanced behind them, hearing the unmistakable clatter of boots echoing through the ruins. Their pursuers were closing in. "We don't have time for sightseeing," Ethan said sharply, gripping her arm. "Move." Lyra nodded, snapping out of her trance, and they pushed through the heavy stone doors into the chamber. The air inside was thick and charged, like the calm before a storm. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface covered in glowing, alien runes. Suspended above it was a crystalline orb, pulsating with light and humming with energy that seemed to resonate deep in their chests. "This is it," Lyra whispered, stepping closer. Her hands trembled as she reached out, the glow of her skin intensifying as if responding to the orb's energy. "This is what they're after." Ethan scanned the room, his instincts on high alert. "What is it? A weapon?" Lyra shook her head, her voice filled with awe. "It's more than that. It's a source of power. A relic from my people's ancient history. It can amplify energy, enhance abilities. It's why they've been hunting me. They want me to activate it." Ethan frowned, his eyes narrowing. "And if they do?" Lyra swallowed hard. "They'll have the power to dominate entire systems. No one will be able to stop them." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we destroy it." Lyra turned to him, her expression stricken. "We can't. If we destroy it, the energy release could wipe out this entire region, and us along with it. But if we can take it, keep it out of their hands." Ethan glanced toward the door. The sound of their pursuers was growing louder. They didn't have much time. "Fine. How do we move it?" Lyra stepped closer to the orb, her glowing hands hovering just above its surface. The light within the crystal pulsed in time with her movements, as if it were alive and responding to her presence. "It's connected to me," she said softly. "I can carry it, but it'll drain me. I don't know how long I'll last." Ethan placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "You'll last. I'll make sure of it." The moment Lyra touched the orb, the room erupted with light. The runes on the walls blazed brightly, and the hum of energy became a deafening roar. Lyra cried out as the orb's energy coursed through her, her body glowing brighter than ever before. Ethan shielded his eyes, his heart pounding as he watched her struggle to contain the power. "I've got it." Lyra gasped, clutching the orb tightly to her chest. Her golden eyes blazed with intensity, but her legs wavered under the strain. Ethan grabbed her arm, steadying her. "We've got company," he growled, turning toward the entrance just as the first soldiers burst into the chamber. The fight was brutal. Ethan fired with precision, each shot taking down an enemy before they could fire back. Lyra, though weakened, used the orb's energy to unleash powerful bursts of light that disoriented and disabled the soldiers. The chamber became a battlefield, the ancient walls trembling under the force of their struggle. Despite their efforts, the sheer number of enemies began to overwhelm them. Ethan gritted his teeth as he fired his last round, then resorted to using his rifle as a blunt weapon. Beside him, Lyra's movements slowed, the strain of holding the orb taking its toll. "We can't hold them off much longer." Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. Lyra's gaze flicked to a glowing symbol etched into the far wall, a pattern that pulsed in sync with the orb. "There's a fail-safe," she yelled. "A way to seal the chamber." Ethan's eyes followed hers, and he immediately understood. "What happens to us if we seal it?" Lyra hesitated, her voice trembling. "We'll be trapped inside, but so will they." Ethan nodded, his expression resolute. "Do it." Lyra raised the orb, channeling its energy into the symbol. The runes on the walls flared to life, their light weaving together to form a barrier around the chamber. The enemy soldiers froze, their weapons clattering to the floor as the energy engulfed them. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies limp and lifeless. The walls of the chamber began to shift, ancient mechanisms grinding into place as the entrance sealed shut. Ethan and Lyra stood at the center, the air around them crackling with residual energy. Silence fell, broken only by their ragged breathing. Ethan leaned against the pedestal, his body bruised and battered but alive. "Well," he said, his voice dry, "that's one way to end a fight." Lyra sank to the floor, the orb still clutched tightly in her hands. Her golden eyes dimmed slightly, exhaustion overtaking her. "We stopped them, but we're trapped." Ethan crouched beside her, a small smirk tugging at his lips despite the gravity of their situation. "Trapped doesn't mean dead. We'll find a way out." Lyra managed a weak smile. "You're relentless, aren't you?" Ethan shrugged, his gaze drifting to the glowing orb. "You'll get used to it." As the chamber settled into stillness, a faint light emanated from the orb, casting a warm glow over them. Though the path ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: they had survived, and together, they would face whatever came next.